where the inadequate resources are likely to be available. So what are some strategies for dealing with this? Well, you could, if you're someplace like the World Bank that are an outside funder and also evaluator, you can commission an independent study of what are the costs of this program likely to be, what are the skill requirements, expertise requirements likely to be, so that at least you have that information. And another thing that can be done is, in terms of the financial resources, say, we need multi-year projections of what this program is going to cost. Don't just tell us what it's going to cost over the next 2 years. Tell us what it's going to cost over the next 10 years and check their figures. Fourth kind of problem that may arise is what I call timeline issues. That is to say, the need for a realistic amount of time to get a policy or a project in place. So, if a program is rushed on an unrealistic timeline, they're likely to lead to poor quality work, cost overruns, and then a public relations fiasco when something doesn't get done. So again, in the United States, healthcare.gov is kind of a classic example of that kind of fiasco. So what are the basic routes? Why do you get programs and projects being rushed online with an inadequate timeline? Well, first thing is, again, the incentives of politicians who want to get the support of the public, and democratic systems want to get elected. They want to show unrealistically fast results to claim credit with voters before the next election. Get it done now so that I can say when I'm up for re-election that I'm going to do it. So that's when they want to claim credit for something. But politicians, I think, even more fundamentally than being credit claimers, are blame avoiders. That is to say, they don't want to get blamed for anything that has gone wrong, even if it's a hurricane and they couldn't stop the hurricane, right? But they want to show a quick response. So things like a hurricane or an oil spill, a quick response is something that they want to act really fast on, and that is likely to lead them to rush things in ways that may be inefficient. Lastly, politicians may view bureaucrats as being not very cooperative, as having their own sorts of objectives, not the policy objectives of the politician. So if we say, get it done in 6 months, or your job is on the line, well, that's a way to push the bureaucrats to get something done now. So all of those things are perfectly reasonable incentives for a politician, but they can have terrible consequences in terms of program effectiveness. So what are some of the risk factors and warning signs? In other words, if you see those things there, you say, we're likely to have a timeline issue. If there's strong public pressure to act, plus an upcoming election. If the implementing agency has never done anything like this before, they're going to have to build up their expertise. They're going to have to coordinate with their other agencies to figure out what to do. And also if it's something where you can kind of measure a comparable. So the president of a country says, I want to get this dam project done in the next 6 months. And you say, well, the last dam project of this scale and magnitude took 10 years. That's a warning sign, right? That your timeline is unrealistic. So what can you do in this sort of situation? When politicians have their minds made up, it's hard to get them to change their minds, but you can certainly commission an independent study to say, look, this timeline is just unrealistic. Okay, a couple more challenges to go. Some of you may have experienced this one in a program or project before. political interference. That is to say, I'm not talking about political interference in the creation of a program, but once a program has already been created, politicians getting involved and trying to interfere with the allocation of program resources to political groups or localities that they favor. Obviously, this creates the risk of inefficient and unfair allocation of resources. Well, where does this come from? Again, no surprise, politicians. Even if they're not elected politicians, even if they are autocrats, they still need to be concerned about keeping support from their political base and the elite of the society. But election-oriented politicians in particular, want to maximize political support, may want to enhance their own income, and by allocating the flow of resources to favored groups or localities. So what are some of the risk factors here that should make you say, we could have an issue with potential political interference whenever a program or policy provides concentrated benefits to particular groups, especially if they're geographically concentrated, if they're weak or non-transparent criteria for allocating resources, if the implementing agencies are poorly insulated from political pressure. In other words, the agency is likely to fold whenever politicians say, we want you to give the benefits to this group or to this locality. And in particular, if you've seen a history of past interference in similar programs. So all these things are sort of warning signs. And well, what can you do with it? To deal with this, a variety of different strategies can be employed, have been employed. And none of them are easy. There are no magic bullets here, right? But increasing the insulation of the implementing agency, appointing, let's say, a strong leader who's known for their independence and getting a pledge from the political leadership that there won't be interference. Sometimes contracting out the provision of a program to NGOs can be a way to lessen political interference. Of course, that doesn't work if the NGO that is being contracted out to is controlled by the spouse of the president or the prime minister or other sorts of political tricks that are often played, but sometimes it works. And then, of course, something that aid agencies have often done is trying to ring fence a project and have direct service provision by the external funders. Of course, that has problems of its own as well, that if you're ring fencing and providing services directly, you're weakening the state, you're lessening pressures from the public to improve the quality of state services, because if people are getting the services they want without the state providing them, then they will be reasonably content. And again, there may still be broader pressures. Okay, so the sixth and last challenge in policy implementation that I'm going to talk about is monitoring and controlling program operators. So what do I mean by a program operator? The term frontline worker is often used. That's a term that I actually use more often than this. But James Q. Wilson, a renowned scholar of bureaucracy, says an operator is a person who does the work that justifies the existence of the organization. So teachers in a school, for example, guards in a prison, doctors and nurses, check writers in a dispersing agency, letter sorters and carriers. The work of the operators determines whether the clients of the agency are satisfied. Okay, so what sorts of problems can go wrong with program operators, with these frontline workers? Well, sometimes program operators are trying to undermine the program mission in more or less direct ways. So teachers who do not show up for work, for example, government inspectors who take bribes, those are very direct forms of undermining the work of agencies. But sometimes there are things that occur that at the local level that just seem like it's convenient for the workers. There's not a big conspiracy, but things like workers in vaccination campaigns who use the coolers to store drinks rather than to store the vaccines. Well, it may seem relatively harmless to a relatively unskilled worker, but if it means the vaccines are no good, you got a problem. So what are some of the roots of monitoring and control problems for program operators? And again, it's a whole variety of things. It isn't like there's a single problem. It's like there are a whole complex of problems. The program operators may lack the skills they need to perform the tasks adequately. They may have poor motivation reinforced by poor incentives for good performance. So teachers who don't show up for work, often the reason they don't show up for work in developing countries is it's pretty hard to get them fired, right? So if they have strong unions and strong union contracts that make it difficult to fire workers, they're less likely to be motivated to show up. A third sort of problem is low ability or capacity to monitor program operators, plus some inherent discretion in the job. So Frank mentioned in his talk yesterday, Bob Klitgaard's equation that corruption equals monopoly plus discretion plus accountability. So in that kind of situation, if you can't monitor the workers, there are at least the potential. Fourth kind of thing that can give rise to program operators undermining the purposes of the program is sometimes you have complex supply chains that make it even more difficult to monitor and control behavior of program operators at every stage. So here we have a vaccine campaign that's out in the middle of the desert using a donkey. So monitoring all of the workers in these very complex supply chains is very difficult. A last thing that can arise is what Wilson calls situational imperatives. What he means by situational imperatives is things like, in particular, physical danger for program operators that cause them to deviate from the organizational mission. So think of drug agents in Mexico who were faced with the drug cartels saying, you have a choice, plata o plomo, silver or lead, take my money or I will kill you. That's a pretty strong situational imperative that may cause them to deviate from the organizational mission. And as an old saying in bureaucratic politics goes, when you're up to your ass in alligators, it's difficult to remind yourself that the original objective was to drain the swamp. Okay, so what are some strategies you can use to try to obtain improved performance from program operators? Well, you can monitor their behavior more closely and reward and punish them for poor performance in some situations when it's relatively easy